January 20th, 1953. The wind rolled low across Pennsylvania Avenue like a whisper cold. Sharp, full of things left unsaid. An icy snow drifted over the manicured lawns of the White House, frosting iron fences and thickening on the shoulders of the guards who stood motionless outside. But inside the gates, beneath the marble portico, something was missing. President-elect Dwight D. Eisenhower stood near the steps. Wrapped in a heavy wool coat, his back rigid, his gaze fixed straight ahead. He did not go inside. He would not go inside. This was no accident. No delay. The president waited behind the doors. Harry S. Truman, buttoned in pride and protocol. By tradition, the outgoing president welcomed the incoming one with a handshake and a ride to the ceremony, a symbolic passing of the torch, a show of unity to the world outside. But not today. The car sat waiting. The engine idled. Secret Service eyes flicked between windows. The press shuffled awkwardly in place, unsure where to point their cameras. For all the world's lens, this looked like a simple delay in a peaceful democracy. It wasn't to those who understood. It was a message wrapped in cold steel. I haven't forgotten. Eisenhower's lips never moved. His expression betrayed nothing. But memory moved behind his eyes like a battlefield fog. The insult Truman had once hurled in private, a moment so bitter it shattered more than political civility. It cracked something deeper. A bond between two men who'd never fought beside each other, but had carried the burden of a world burning. Truman, years ago, had mocked him, diminished his service, belittled his responsibility. Eisenhower never responded. He saluted. He obeyed. He led, but he never forgot. And now he stood not as a general, not as a politician, but as a soldier, honoring something higher than tradition. The car door opened. Eisenhower stepped in, but never looked back. Truman emerged only seconds later, smiling for the camera, shaking hands with the press. But the winter wind knew what the photographs didn't. That before the ceremony, before the fanfare and oaths, a silent war had already been won, and Eisenhower had not crossed the line. Spring 1945, the war in Europe was ending in fire and flags, and the man standing at its edge wasn't a king or politician. It was a general. Dwight D. Eisenhower had commanded the largest amphibious invasion in history, coordinated armies across blood-soaked continents, and stared into the ruined heart of Nazi Germany. Cameras captured him, smiling, waving, saluting. But he never looked comfortable in the spotlight. His comfort came from duty, not applause. And in April, as flags fell at half-mast for Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Washington summoned a man who hadn't fought a single battle. Harry S. Truman, the Senator Feud, remembered. The vice president, barely noticed, was now president of the United States. Eisenhower stood tall in his uniform. Truman, in his round spectacles and humble voice, extended praise and friendliness. They shook hands. Smiles were exchanged. But beneath the white columns of Washington, foundations were shifting. At first, it was minor things. Truman spoke of ending the war quickly. Ike wanted precision. Truman valued force. Ike demanded patience. When asked to still serve America as chief of staff after the war, Eisenhower agreed, but he felt the leash tightening. Then came the press. Briefings. Truman started talking like a man at center stage, referring to Hiroshima as merely military necessity, describing MacArthur's ego as tiresome. And when asked of Eisenhower's role in transitional politics, Truman waved it away. I doubt Ike wants anything to do with Washington after this. It was said offhand, but Ike heard it. Not the words, but the dismissal inside them. Eisenhower didn't answer with protest. He answered like a soldier. Work harder. Mission first. But war had taught him something politics never could. Command isn't given. It's earned. And respect, once lost, rarely returns. Late one night, after a particularly cold meeting in the West Wing, Eisenhower wrote in his leather-bound diary, the same leather worn soft from days on the Western Front. I swore loyalty to the office, not the man. That line must be remembered. Truman liked Ike in his own way, admired him as a war hero. But war heroes had a way of casting long shadows, and Harry S. Truman had lived most of his life in other men's shadow. Now, as president, any rival glow, even unintended, felt like a threat. He began to speak of Eisenhower less like a partner and more like a risk, behind closed doors, "Eisenhower doesn't understand civilian leadership. That's why we leave war to warriors and peace to the people." He meant it as a line for the room, but it sunk like lead through the walls. The divide had begun. Quiet, civil, smiling in public, steel in private. Eisenhower wasn't surprised. He'd seen men draw lines before they fired their first shot, but he also understood this: Truman was no dictator, no villain. He was something far more dangerous, a different kind of patriot, ... Walking a road Ike refused to follow, and the farther they both walked that path, the clearer it became. It began with a whisper, the kind that always sounds loud behind closed doors. Summer, 1948. The war was 3 years behind them, but its shadows reached long. Truman was clawing through a brutal re-election campaign, trailing behind Republican candidate Thomas Dewey and losing ground fast. Every newspaper called him a lame duck. Every radio analyst counted him out. And then came the suggestion that changed the war inside Washington. Someone floated the idea, what if Eisenhower ran? They didn't know which party, left or right, it didn't matter. He was Eisenhower, and in 1948, that name still carried the sound of Normandy, of victory, of salvation. Across America, soldiers' widows framed his photo beside folded flags. Children in schools drew maps with his name scribbled large. His smile had reassured a bleeding world. His silence felt like strength. To many, he wasn't just a general, he was America. When Truman heard the talk, his lips twisted behind a tight smile. Out loud, he said little. In private, he exploded. "He's a damn good general," he said to his aides. "But if he wants to run for mayor, he should try his hometown before he comes for this chair. Maybe he can start by being a dog catcher." The room fell silent. Everyone heard it, because it wasn't sarcasm. It was a strike by the next morning. The quote had surfaced in D.C. circles, like oil on water. The press got wind, columnists fished for responses. White House aides denied he meant it that way. But it didn't matter. The words had left his mouth and reached Eisenhower like a letter bomb. The general never said anything publicly, but inside, something hardened. He had tolerated nuclear disagreement. He had forgiven being left out of decisions. He had swallowed watching MacArthur get dragged through the mud by the same administration he now served. But this wasn't politics. This was personal. That night, Eisenhower sat alone in his study, his war medals tucked safely away, a freshly sharpened pencil resting beside a blank notepad. He didn't write back. He didn't leak to newspapers. He simply picked up the reports of returning veterans being denied housing, of military budgets slashed, command decisions reversed with signatures, and he started working. Not as a general anymore, but as something he'd never wanted to be. A statesman. His colleagues sensed the shift. Cabinet members noticed the way he no longer nodded through briefings. Senators found new letters written in his hand, measured, precise. Cutting through bureaucratic fog like a knife through cloth, he was preparing not for revenge, but for something deeper, a course correction. Truman, for his part, went silent on the issue, but the tension hung in every small room they shared. The next time they stood near each other, a dedication event for a fallen soldier, Truman gave a speech. Eisenhower stood in paradressed posture beside him. When Truman gestured playfully for Ike to say a few words, the general turned to the flag and didn't move. The press asked him later if he was feeling unwell. He answered calmly, "I felt the moment belonged to someone else." A polite answer, but the message couldn't be missed. Eisenhower would not stand with someone who treated public service like a personal throne. And yet, the real twist didn't come from Eisenhower. It came from the people. Polls surged. Draft Eisenhower posters appeared across college campuses. Veterans groups began circulating petitions. Newspapers speculated which party he would choose if he accepted. Some even published mock cabinets with his face at the top, beneath the headline, "The Return of the General." And Truman, who had clawed his way up from bankruptcy to the resolute desk, saw his own political legacy begin to buckle. He no longer smiled when reporters mentioned Ike, because it wasn't a rivalry. Anymore, it was a reckoning, and the real battle hadn't even begun. August 6, 1945, news broke before sunrise. A new weapon had been dropped on Japan, a city called Hiroshima, erased in seconds. The headline screamed, It was a triumph. Radio voices called it justice. Reporters dared to use words like necessary. But in a quiet office far from the celebration, General Dwight D. Eisenhower read the telegram and sat down hard in his chair. He had known about the bomb, of course, at least in shadows, whispers during briefings, but he had never known the order would be given so quickly, or that his opposition would be ignored so completely. Weeks earlier, Eisenhower had told Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War, what he truly believed. Japan is already defeated. There's no need to hit them with that thing. Eisenhower wasn't a man to speak emotionally, but he spoke plain, clearly. He believed the bomb wasn't military strategy. It was intimidation for the Soviets, for the future, not for the present battlefield. He said it. Truman didn't listen, and when the mushroom cloud rose over Hiroshima, Eisenhower didn't cheer. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just stared into the distance, remembering every young boy he'd sent to die with a rifle, and wondering when war stopped being a burden and started being a decision made by men who'd never worn boots in mud by the time Nagasaki followed, and the world went silent in radioactive horror. Eisenhower had already written it in his journal. I was against it, but I was not asked. One sentence, one sharp scar. They were both leaders of men, but the decisions Truman made alone rested on Eisenhower's conscience like an unwanted echo. And then came another blow. April 1951. Seoul burned. Korea groaned beneath war once again. And General Douglas MacArthur, controversial, brilliant, insubordinate, was dismissed by Harry Truman. With a single stroke of a pen, Eisenhower read it in the newspaper like the rest of the country. MacArthur wasn't perfect. Eisenhower knew that better than anyone. They had once served under the same roof. But one thing was clear: you don't fire the man fighting the war unless you're ready to wear the boots yourself. Veterans wept. Conservatives raged. Across America, glory turned to ash. Truman addressed the nation that night, calm, determined, a decision based on principle, he said. But behind closed doors, Eisenhower sat on the porch of his Gettysburg farmhouse in silence, ash flicking from the cigarette dangling loose between his fingers. The press began calling. Radio hosts whispered about a possible Eisenhower candidacy now that MacArthur had been humiliated. The message? If they'd do it to Mac, what would they do to Ike? He didn't answer. Not yet. But something inside had moved slow, like tectonic plates. Eisenhower had once survived under Patton's fury, under Churchill's pressure, under Roosevelt's charm, but nothing burned quite like watching decorated generals become political liabilities. He understood the danger now, not of foreign bombs, but of Washington's forgetfulness, its eagerness to bury the very men who had saved civilization when it no longer suited headlines. Meanwhile, Truman was rewriting legacy, giving speeches about civilian control, framing MacArthur's firing as a defense of the Constitution. But veterans weren't fooled. Eisenhower wasn't either. He buried it all, every disagreement, every silent feud, every decision where he had been cut out. He did not write a memoir. He did not call a press conference. That was not his way. Instead, he began taking meetings, Republican senators, war widows, economists, former GIS. It looked innocent. Conversations, nothing more, but in truth, Eisenhower was assembling not a campaign, but a counteroffensive. Values had been compromised. Honor was being suffocated inside. Marble walls, someone had to revive it, and if the president wouldn't, the general would. One morning in late '51, Eisenhower visited a small VA hospital in New Jersey. The nurses didn't know he was coming. The building wasn't staged. He walked in quietly, greeted each wounded man by name, sat beside double amputees with faces blown half away. An old sergeant, throat rasped, with lung injuries, asked him, "What's left, sir? What are we still fighting for?" Eisenhower didn't blink. "We're fighting to remember that some things are too sacred to politicize." That answer would never make the papers, but it never needed to, because for the first time, Eisenhower realized that the battlefield he had trained for all his life wasn't in Europe or Korea anymore. It was in Washington, between egos and truths, between heroes forgotten and headlines rewritten, and he had one more campaign to lead, not with tanks, but with silence sharpened into action. The storm didn't arrive in one gust. It built quiet, steady, like a weather front beyond the horizon, advancing step by step until the windows began to rattle. By 1952, Truman's presidency was bleeding approval. Korea dragged on, inflation soared. Cities boiled in strikes. Trust had become a luxury no one believed in anymore, and through the noise, one name echoed louder than any speech: Eisenhower. For months, the Republican Party sent letters, delegations, invitations. "Run for president," they pleaded. "Save the country." Even Democrats, the old Roosevelt men, whispered his name with longing, as if saying it too loud would summon shame. Never wanted to be, command was a burden, not a legacy. And besides, leadership, real leadership, lived in action, not applause, but the headlines sharpened. Graves multiplied in Korea. Disillusionment swallowed the capital. Then came the moment he couldn't ignore. Newspaper clipping arrived at Ike's home in Gettysburg, folded, unmarked. No. Return label. Truman had given a speech half policy, half provocation. "The world doesn't need any more generals preaching peace," he said. "It needs presidents who understand it." It wasn't subtle. Eisenhower, opening the envelope in silence, stared long at those lines. He didn't sigh. He didn't speak. He just set it down beside the photo of fallen soldiers he kept near his writing desk. One day earlier, he had visited Arlington, and once again, men who'd defended the Republic now lay under the frost. As arguments about their sacrifice echoed in the Senate chamber, like game pieces being moved on a board, he stood there for a long time that evening. Mamie found him by the window. Lost in thought, "You'll lose everything you love if you enter that world," she warned gently. "Maybe," he answered, "but I've already watched too much of it get lost by staying out." In private, Eisenhower had cursed war. But Washington, it needed fighting still. One thing kept him unsure: his oath not to office, not even to rank, but to country, the one he had defended with orders and silence. Could he enter politics without soiling what he stood for? He looked back on every general he admired: Grant, Washington. Men who traded uniforms for suits without losing their soul. He realized it wasn't about speeches or slogans. It was about protecting the Republic when words weren't enough anymore. And Truman, word arrived that the president wouldn't seek re-election. Publicly, he cited age, respect for Democratic turnover, but behind closed doors, rage. If Eisenhower thinks this is military duty, he'll learn quickly Washington corrupts everyone. But Eisenhower wasn't running to correct Truman. He was running to protect what Truman had left behind: a trust that was eroding, a dignity that was fading, and a citizenship slipping into disillusionment. Ike for President buttons flooded city streets. Veterans led parades. Children wrote him letters. Farmers painted his name onto barn roofs. Eisenhower finally responded, not with a rally, with a train ride he boarded quietly. Crossed the Midwest, met families who had sons still overseas, mothers who'd buried boys under foreign flags, old men who saluted like they still wore the uniform at every stop. He didn't promise riches or revenge. He promised memories would not be forgotten, that their sacrifice meant something. And when a reporter asked why he was running, he looked out at the small crowd standing in the rain. Because someone needs to remember what the oath means, and I still do. For the first time, he didn't stand and salute. He stood to lead. And Washington began to prepare for the return of a soldier. Not to battle, but to war nonetheless. January 20th, 1953. The nation exhaled under a white teeming sky. Snow drifted across the Capitol like falling ash, silencing the sound of sirens, horns, engines. Inauguration Day had come again, but this time with no confetti. No Roosevelt, no war. Only ghosts watching from marble columns. And in front of the White House stood a man who had been trained never to hesitate. But today, he didn't move. President-elect Dwight D. Eisenhower had arrived on time early. In fact, his breath visible in the cold air. His overcoat collar stiff against the wind. A Secret Service car idled nearby. A Marine held the door open, waiting for two men who were supposed to ride together. Only one had arrived. Tradition called for the outgoing president to escort the incoming one from the White House to the Capitol, a symbolic passing of the torch, of peace, of unity, and by all presidential accounts, Harry S. Truman was waiting inside. The door stood open. The vestibule glowed warm. Men in suits whispered behind curtains. But Eisenhower stayed outside. He gazed up at the portico, but didn't approach it. His wife Mamie stood beside him, glancing upward once before turning her eyes to the street. There were no greetings, no laughter, just a silence deeper than any artillery barrage he'd ever heard. A White House aide, young and shaking in the cold, stepped out and approached them. "Sir, the President is ready to welcome you inside." Eisenhower turned slightly, but his eyes didn't meet the man's. "I'll wait here." The aide hesitated, uncertain if this was miscommunication. "Sir, it eats protocol." Eisenhower didn't answer. He simply turned his gaze back toward the street, toward the Capitol dome glowing faintly in the white sky, his jaw tight. He had heard the general refused to come in. His aides looked to him for instruction. Should we step out? Should we go on ahead? He held up his hand. Slowly, carefully, he adjusted his jacket. "Fine, let's go." By the time Truman joined Eisenhower outside, there were cameras waiting press lining up for the traditional photo of one president aiding the next. But what they captured wasn't aid, it was ice. Truman raised his hand. Eisenhower gave him half a nod, military, formal, not warm. There were no smiles, no kind words, nothing spoken between them that day, save a brittle series of polite phrases. Required by ceremonial gravity, they entered the car. Truman tried small talk during the ride. "Capitol looks good in the snow, doesn't it?" Silence. "Then, when I rode here with Roosevelt, he didn't say a word either. But that was because he was dying." Stillness. The general glanced out the window to the city he hadn't seen like this, quiet, powerful, distant. This city had once cheered his victories. Now he would return here not as a commander, but as president, and he would do it without stepping into that house until he could walk in as its master, not its forgiven guest. They reached the Capitol steps. Music began. The oath was taken. The sun broke faintly over the rooftops as Eisenhower swore allegiance not to a party, not to revenge it, but to the Constitution, and the oath that had never once left his bloodstream. In the crowd stood war heroes, widows, politicians he distrusted, even some children of the men he'd lost at Omaha Beach. But somewhere not too far away, the insults still rang in a small corner of his mind. He should try mayor first. We don't need generals preaching peace. And through it all, Eisenhower had said nothing even when the echo haunted him. But today, he had answered not in sound, in stance. Later, after the ceremony, a reporter asked one of Eisenhower's aides why the general hadn't stepped inside the White House before the ride. The answer was whispered, but sharp enough to cut through the recording devices. He had said he wouldn't cross the threshold of a house that disrespected the uniform. That story never made it into the official record. But the men who were there that day told it to their sons. Their sons told it to theirs. You don't always need to raise your voice to finish a war. Sometimes, ... you just don't walk through the door. Years passed, not quickly, not loudly. Eisenhower's first term turned into a second. He was popular, presidential.com, when storms rocked the nation, firm when tempers bled across borders. Truman, now out of office, watched from independence. Missouri, a porch, a pipe, a memory fading behind newspaper pages. He no longer authored. The two men never met again. In private, no apology, no invitation, no final toast to shared sacrifice, whatever had broken between them on that cold January morning in 1953 had been quietly buried, not forgiven, not healed, simply placed in the earth like a folded flag. Eisenhower would never mention it, publicly, not to press, not to biographers, but those closest to him, secretaries, aides, war widows who sat across from his resolute desk, they knew. When Truman's name came up, a familiar stillness entered the room. Not anger, not insult. Grief, like remembering a trusted comrade who had chosen the wrong time to pull the trigger. Truman, for his part, defended everything to the end of his life. He upheld the necessity of Hiroshima, the firing of MacArthur, the cuts to the military, and the rise of civilian power. But inside, something had chipped away, not with headlines, but with Eisenhower's silence. Because Truman didn't fear insult. He feared irrelevance. Endyke, in refusing to grant him that final ceremonial gesture, had made him vanish from history's frame in a single moment. One president rose, the other retreated, a decade after Eisenhower left office. The world began losing them. First, Truman, December 26, 1972, pneumonia. Independence mourned. Flags were lowered. Obituaries called him gritty, blunt, constitutional. But the front pages had changed. Vietnam now stole headlines. Watergate loomed. Truman's truth, and perhaps his failings, dissolved in more modern scandals. 3 years later, Eisenhower passed March 1969. Not in his sleep, not in grandeur, just gone. He lay in state in the Capitol, Rotunda, under the same dome where he had taken his oath in a snowstorm 16 years earlier. Over 100,000 people passed his coffin. Many were strangers, but some were veterans who had followed his orders across blood-soaked sands, who had buried friends in foreign hills, and only survived because Eisenhower had planned the timing right, the target tight, the retreat clean. They didn't talk about politics. They just said, "He remembered us." 2 presidents, 2 American legends, 2 graves that sat over 1,000 miles apart. One in Independence, one in Kansas. They would never be side by side. Not in death, not in story, but people still page through the archives, still ask, did Eisenhower ever truly forgive Truman? The answer was never printed. But history whispers this: no dot, because Eisenhower was not a man of grudges. He was a man of boundaries, and Truman had crossed the wrong. 1. Not by words, but by forgetting what uniforms meant. On a visit to Normandy many years later, a young American colonel paused at one of the thousands of white crosses. He was with 2 older men, both retired officers. One said, with his hand resting on the marble, "You know, I once asked Ike if he and Truman made peace in the end." What did he say? The old man smiled. He said, "Some burdens you don't put down. You just learn how to carry them." And he did. Eisenhower carried millions. He just never let anyone carry his. The White House doorway Eisenhower refused to cross still stands. Solid stone, black oak siding. Hundreds of men have entered through it since. Men with dreams, envy, vision, ambition. But only one man ever stood before that door summoned, expected, and chose not to step inside, because something sacred had already been crossed long ago. That moment wasn't photographed. There was no headline reading "President refuses entry." No camera fast enough to catch what was happening in the realm of principle, pride, and old wounds. But people remembered. Not immediately, not loudly, but over time. Generation by generation, the story moved from aide to journalist, from forgotten transcript to uncovered diary, from passing mention to legend, and legends, once rooted in truth, begin to breathe. Not because they're loud, but because they whisper something timeless. Cadets at West Point would one day study strategy through Eisenhower's operational brilliance, but in quieter rooms, after the maps had been folded and the casualty reports discussed. Some instructors would mention that cold morning in 1953, they'd say there was a moment Ike stood still and taught a lesson louder than any parade. And they'd pause, because the silence was part of the story. Because leadership, the true kind, sometimes came not from seizing power, but by refusing to bend to it. Some said Eisenhower should have let it go, that men make mistakes, that forgiveness was nobility. But Ike never spoke out against him. He didn't write an exposé. He didn't insult him in memoirs. He simply drew a line and never uncrossed it. And in doing that, gave the country a different kind of memory. Not the kind scripted in marble or stitched into campaign slogans, but the kind whispered at military funerals, passed between veterans in silence, or worn like invisible armor by those who still carry the cost of service in their bones. When a White House historian tried to document entire presidential transition customs, he asked one elderly staff member if he remembered anything unusual about the Eisenhower. "Transfer." The old man paused. "I remember he waited," he said. The historian raised an eyebrow. "Waited where?" "Outside." And with that answer, the record deepened. Not just historically, humanly today, a visitor walking past the same column Eisenhower stood beside wouldn't notice anything different. The flag still waves. The steps are cleaned. The doorway swings freely at the touch of every new hand. But in January, if the wind hits just right, the air slows, as if something still lingers there, a presence made not of politics, but of poise. The story is still told, sometimes in speeches, more often in whispers. Eisenhower didn't refuse power. He just refused to smile at the man who misused it. That moment became a line in military code, a reminder to young officers: never confuse rank with honor. And remember, sometimes the most powerful way to lead is to say nothing at all and stay standing outside the house you no longer trust. He didn't leave a memoir titled, "My Decision Not to Enter." He didn't need to. History would build that doorframe for him, and the world still walks past it. History loves loud men, the ones who shout into microphones, wave their fists behind lecterns, rewrite truth with applause. But every now and then, it remembers someone different, a man who didn't insult, didn't shout, didn't flinch. When Dwight D. Eisenhower refused to enter the White House on Inauguration Day 1953, he wasn't breaking protocol. He was protecting something, not his ego, but the memory of every man he buried in silence. The oath he carried long after the battles ended, the belief that leadership means more than power, it means principle. Truman moved on. The press moved on. But Eisenhower's stillness echoed because it showed us something we forget to isolate in times of noise: that power can be peaceful, that revenge isn't always answered in blood, that dignity doesn't need an audience. The legacy he left us wasn't carved into monuments. It stood briefly thin as breath on one cold winter step in the space between ceremony and conviction. There was no book titled "How I Refused the Handshake," no press release, just a decision made by a soldier who had once led a world at war, and who believed the real victory came after the battlefield. He didn't step forward that day, and by doing so, he moved a nation. If stories like this speak to you tales of courage, conviction, and the moments that changed history, and share and remember the quiet steps that never made headlines, but rewrote the meaning of leadership forever.